in June of 1953, a meeting of the Politburo was held, and the colleagues of Beria realized that he was a very great danger to them, and that therefore he had to be liquidated. And this practically meant that he was arrested first, taken away, and then at some point in time later, one account is many months later, in December of 1953, he was executed. And in this graphic novel here, he's being brought to the execution chamber where he himself had sent so many people to be killed. So what has this resulted in? It's resulted in this manuscript, which you now see, which is currently under review in the Journal of Medical Biography, basically telling you the story that I've told here in some detail, using the graphic novel, which of course we did not use in our manuscript. Now, the next one is Napoleon Bonaparte. And this, again, my connection here goes back to a visit that my wife and I took to the island of Elba. And Elba is a wonderful place. It's off the coast of Tuscany. And this is where Napoleon went to his first exile. And this was a very pleasant place to be exiled. It had a wonderful climate, beautiful surroundings, lovely quarters, and it was not escape-proof. And within I think it was 100 days, he was rescued from Elba and carried on then for a number of military campaigns to the defeat at Waterloo. And this time the British decided that now we're really going to put him in a faraway place. So they brought him to St. Helena, which is located approximately 2,000 miles from, 2,000 kilometers from Rio de Janeiro and 2,500 or so from Johannesburg, South Africa. And my only experience with Elba was seeing this, seeing St. Helena, was seeing it from an airplane when I was flying from Johannesburg to Rio de Janeiro. And this is not what I saw because I was at 35,000 feet, and this is probably much, much closer. But it's a volcanic island. It's not a very hospitable place, although it did have a population at the time that Napoleon was sent there of several thousand people. Whoops. And it's a small island. It's only about 50 square miles. It had been settled by the British East India Company and was kind of an important way station for ships that were traveling, British ships traveling in the South Atlantic. And Napoleon then was placed, after being in temporary quarters, in Longwood House, which if you look at this lovely picture taken a few years ago, seems quite nice. And outside it, you see a French flag here flying, because this property had actually been given to France by the British. So this was actually French sovereign territory. This was many, many years after the death of Napoleon. Now, this is just what some of the furnishings looked like here in Longwood House, and they actually don't look too bad. They look pretty good, as a matter of fact. Reading something about what Longwood House sounded like, it didn't sound as if it was nice as that. Now, Longwood House, St. Helena basically was escape-proof for Napoleon, so that faded into the distance, and he basically settled into life here. In the period that he was here, started in 1815. And then he was doing reasonably well until 1820, September of 1820. And he had a number of complaints relating to stomach pains, nausea, headaches, and constipation alternating with diarrhea, and also sporadic episodes of fever, chills, and jaundice, which suggest that he may have had hepatitis. Beginning in October of 1820, his health deteriorated very rapidly. He experienced persistent abdominal pain, vomiting, nausea, difficulty swallowing, constipation, night sweats, and this then continued on, and the last 40 days of his life were very difficult, with a strong diffuse abdominal pain, fever, vomiting, night sweats, vomiting blood at times, and high heart rate. And this is the painting of the death scene of Napoleon, with people assembled, and there was a fairly large entourage that he had there from France, as well as he had made friends with a number of his British jailers. And this is purportedly his last words that were barely decipherable, but some thought he said head of the army, and then the word France, and then supposedly my son, and then Josephine. Now, in the case of Napoleon, there was a more complete autopsy report. And unequivocally, what he had was a gastric cancer, stomach cancer, that had spread extensively to the lymph nodes surrounding the stomach, and then bleeding in his stomach, and a number of other pathologic findings, including, and I've added this on, possible exposure to arsenic. And this then eventually resulted in another narrative, and once it was possible to really quantify arsenic precisely, developed. And eventually his body, which had been initially buried in St. Helena, was sometime later, 30 or 40 years later, brought to Paris and placed in Les Invalides. So the counter-argument then was that in reality, did Napoleon die of arsenic poisoning? Because by a new technique at the time in the 1960s of atomic emission spectroscopy, high levels of arsenic had been found in his hair. And that counter-narrative really gained considerable strength. So, how does one deal with this counter-narrative? Well, Dr. Hinmarsh has dealt with this in a very convincing way. First, that there was no convincing clinical evidence that indicates that Napoleon died from arsenic poisoning. He didn't have the skin changes characteristic of chronic arsenic poisoning, and a number of other changes that one might expect in someone who is suffering from arsenic poisoning. Further, he didn't demonstrate any progressive weight loss. In fact, when he was in St. Helena, he actually gained weight, and then eventually, in his terminal illness, when his gastric cancer was really taking hold, he actually lost weight. So, given the conclusion that Napoleon did not suffer arsenic poison, what was the source of the hair arsenic? Arsenic was ubiquitous in the 19th century, being used extensively as a rodenticide, an insecticide, preservative, and it was also used to dust hair in samples. In other words, a sample of a lock of someone's hair, to preserve that, it might be dusted with arsenic. And it was also actually even used in paints. So there's no evidence from Napoleon's extensive medical records that he took arsenic as a medicine. Indeed, he was highly skeptical of doctors and their remedies, having stated, "You medical people will have more lives to answer for in the other world than even we generals," which I think gives you some idea of his contempt for medicine at the time, which was actually, I think, well-founded. So, we suspect that the source of the, and we meaning Hindmarsh and Savory here, we suspect that the source of the arsenic in Napoleon's hair was from the common practice of adding a pinch of arsenic trioxide as a preservative to hair samples, cut as mementos and used as arsenic-containing hair powder. The emperor said, "History is but a fable oft repeated. We hope that modern scientific techniques have provided us with some improvements on this statement." And indeed, I think they have. Now, up until relatively recently, meaning 2016, if you wanted to go to St. Helena, the only way you could really go there was by boat. And finally, the British government spent $350 million to build an airport. So now, if anyone is interested in going to St. Helena, there are weekly flights that go there from Johannesburg, South Africa. So, what is the final take-home message of this presentation? Historically, autopsies have filled multiple needs which have been important for the families of decedents, physicians taking care of patients, and perhaps most significantly for the advancement of medical science. The importance of autopsy remains unchanged in spite of the decline in autopsy rates. At one point in time, at most university hospitals in the United States, autopsy rates might be as high as 50% of all deaths would result in an autopsy. But now, basically, this has declined very significantly. And it's primarily really in forensic autopsy sittings, such as Franklin County Coroner's Office, where autopsies are very, very common. It is often stated that advances in basic medical science and imaging have reduced the need for autopsies. While these advances have been great, the need for autopsies continues in multiple areas, including teaching. In other words, in our training of pathologists they are required to do 50 autopsies in the course of their residency training. Quality assurance, determination of exact causes of death, and as shown in this presentation today, the causes which otherwise would have remained unknown. So with that, I will conclude, and if there are questions, be happy to try to answer them.
Do we hear questions?
Yes.